All right, I think I found a way to increase the size of allowable uploads to YouTube. So this segment will be longer. This will be more like a regular lecture length. So last time we stopped, I introduced the 3 categories that we can place all our actions into, right? Morally obligated, morally prohibited, and morally permissible. So with that in mind, that gives you a little bit of idea about how to kind of think of the terrain when we're talking about the morality of our actions. Now we're going to get more into what the idea of a theory of right action is, why we would be interested in it, and then we'll start talking about what a theory of right action may look like. And then ultimately, I think by the end of the lecture, I'm going to introduce one particular theory of right action that we're going to consider for the next few lectures. A theory of morally right action is going to be a philosophical theory that tells us which of our actions fall into those various categories and why. It's pretty much as simple as that. We want a theory that explains and tells us which of our actions are morally obligatory, which are morally prohibited, and which are morally permissible, and why they fall into those various categories. Now, this is like our other topics that we considered during the semester. It's a philosophically interesting topic. We might be curious and want to know, why is it that certain things are morally wrong, certain things are morally right? Just like we wanted to know, what things are rational to believe, what things are not rational to believe, and other questions that we asked this semester. There's something more, perhaps, to the question of right action, in that it may go beyond just intellectual curiosity to want to know what the right answer is. So take some of the topics we considered earlier, so the topics in metaphysics, like the question of personal identity, right? That question is a very interesting question. The question of what we are, whether we're just bodies, or whether we're just essentially our minds, or whatever the answer is. That's something that's something we may be very curious about intellectually and want to know the answer. That might be important to us in various ways. And with morality, though, I want to compare this to morality in that it seems like there may be something more when we're talking about a theory of morally right action, in that beyond just being curious about what it is to do the right thing or do the wrong thing, we have as people a kind of sense of obligation or moral responsibility to do the right thing, right? So we're obligated. We feel not just curious about what the right thing is to do, but we feel obligated to try to do the right thing as people, as morally decent people. So there's this kind of underlying motivation to know what the right thing is, not just out of curiosity, but out of a sense of duty or responsibility that, as people, we should try to treat others well. We should try to be doing the right thing, to taking the right course in life. So beyond just the theoretical interest in a theory of right action, it seems as though there's also a kind of, we might call it a practical interest. When I say practical, I use it in the sense that philosophers sometimes do, where practical has to do with action. So it's not just, so sometimes philosophers contrast theory and practice, and what they mean there is talking about, things that you can know, or things that you're interested in from just a purely intellectual standpoint, with things that you're actually, actions that you're actually taking and decisions that you're actually making in your life. And with the subject of right action, of morally right action, there's both elements. We can be interested in it from a purely theoretical point of view, but it's also something that we're interested in and motivated to know the right answer to, because we are motivated to act in certain ways. We want to do the right thing. We want to make morally proper decisions, at least if we're psychologically normal, morally decent people. So there's an interesting sense of obligation that morality has on us as people. And we could talk about that at some length, but we won't right now. But you get the idea. I mean, I'm sure those of you who are normal in the class, you feel some sense of obligation or responsibility to do the morally right thing, to not treat people in ways that are immoral, etc. So the question of what is it to act morally right and morally wrong, or more specifically in terms of our categories that we laid out last time, what is it to do something that's morally obligated, to do something that's morally prohibited, to do something that's morally permissible? These are interesting questions, theoretically and practically. And the theory of right action is, as you may imagine, it's a central question in ethics. What is it to act morally right or morally wrong? Okay, so that gives you a bit of introduction to the general question of the theory of morally right action. Now let's look at sort of trying to answer the question: what is the proper way to think about morally right action? What is the theory that explains which actions are morally right and which actions aren't? Why? So to start to figure that out, if you set out to answer that question, if I asked you guys, if I said, hey, tell me, what things are morally right and wrong, you might start thinking about it, and you could probably come up with some sort of list, right? So, off the top of your head, what comes to mind? Well, what kind of things seem like they're the morally wrong thing to do? Well, you might be thinking, well, cheating, stealing, lying, physically harming people, things like that, right? So that kind of stuff comes to mind. I said, what's the morally right thing to do? Being honest, helping people when I can, working hard, things like that. So if we kind of go with this approach of just drawing up a list, we might be able to drop some sort of rough list. So think about, say, the 10 Commandments. They are this kind of list. They're a kind of list of things that you should do. I think a lot of them are prohibitions, more things that are morally prohibited, right? It's like, do not kill, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, things like that. And there may be some obligations on there too, like, honor your parents. I think that's on there. So imagine that we draw up some list. We think about it for a bit, and we try to draw up some list of what the morally right things to do, what kind of things are morally wrong. And we write it down. I have an example in the notes that I'm going to put up with these lectures of some things that might be on the list, right? So you might think, well, that's what we do. We just sit down, we come up with some list, write it all down, think about it a little bit, and then boom, we have our theory of morally right action, and we're done. But there's a couple problems in such approach, and talking about them will get us, I think, to see some of the virtues of the next theory that I'm going to introduce. So let's say that we have a list of what we think are the morally right and morally wrong things to do, like the example that I put in the notes there. There's a couple problems for this kind of idea that we could just get a list like this. One is that if you look at the items on the list and you think about it, well, let me ask you this. Do you think that the items on the list that I drew, which include, say, don't kill, don't steal, those are the first two ones on my list, do you think that those are truly moral rules that you always have to follow? Now, I hope that some of you who thought about it for a moment are thinking, well, maybe not, right? So take the rule, I think it's the second rule on my list. Take the one, don't steal, right? Is it true that it's always immoral to steal? Ask yourself that. If not, can you think of a scenario where it's not immoral to steal? Now, I hope that some of you may be able to think of one. Now, in fact, if you go back in the semester, when we talked about free will, I think I gave you an example of a kind of scenario where it seems to me that it's pretty clear that it's not immoral to steal. So do you remember that one? Does anybody remember that one? Well, I'll jog your memory a little bit. It had to do with your family being abducted and threatened, right? So now some of you might recall this example that we talked about a bit, which was that your family's abducted, and let's say I abduct them, and I call you and I say, I want you to go down to Stop and Shop, and I want you to steal some paper towels from me. Or, I want you to go down to the lunch cart and the liberal arts building, and I want you to steal a sandwich from me. And if you don't, I'm going to do really horrible things to your family. Now, in that situation, would it be immoral for you to steal? I think that a lot of you think, no, it wouldn't. It wouldn't be immoral for me to steal. In fact, right, it seems like in that case, it may well be morally obligatory for you to steal. Stealing may be morally obligated in that situation, right? So that's a problem, because that's a problem, at least for my list, because my second rule is don't steal. And it looks like it's not always immoral to steal, right? Now, I just using stealing as an example, I think that if we go through on that list, everything that I put on that list falls prey to this same kind of problem. It may be, a rule of thumb. It may be often that you shouldn't steal, or often that you shouldn't do the other things I write on the list, but there are going to be situations where it seems like you should not follow the rule. So I don't have the list in front of me, but I think that, say, one of the things on the list is help others. Right? Seems good. It seems so if that rule is right, that's telling us something that is morally obligated for us to do. We're morally obligated to help others. Right? Now, is that always true? Well, maybe can you think of a scenario where it's not? There's probably lots of scenarios, right? Let's say that you have something very important to do. You have to. Forget that one. Let's say that you go into the dorm room. You're walking down the hall and you see some smoke coming out of one of the dorm rooms, and you knock on the door and you're concerned, and you open it up, and there's somebody in there, and he's like, "Hey, I'm making this chemical bomb in here, and I'm having some trouble. Do you think you can come in here and help me out?" Well, are you morally obligated to help that person? No, probably not. No, actually, you're morally obligated, presumably, to not help that person. So that rule, falls prey to a kind of counterexample or case that shows that it's not really ultimately a universal moral rule. And I think everything on the list, we can do the same kind of thing. We can come up with a situation where it looks like we should not follow the rule. Even the first rule, right, which on my list is don't kill. Can you think of situations where it seems like it may be at least morally permissible to kill? Okay, well, I think some of you probably are able to do that, right? So if you were thinking something like, in a war situation, for example, let's say the enemy's coming at you, you're in a war, is it morally permissible for you to kill the enemy? A lot of people will want to say yes. What about a situation where, let's say that you're sleeping peacefully in your dorm room or your apartment tonight, and a violent maniac breaks into your room and starts attacking you with a knife and trying to stab you to death. And let's imagine that you struggle with this person and you get the knife away, and in the struggle you stab the person and you kill the person. You kill your attacker. Did you do something that's morally prohibited there? I think a lot of us will say that no, you didn't. That was morally permissible for you to do that in that situation. You were defending your life. So even that first rule, which in most situations it is going to be true. In most situations, you should not kill another person. It looks like there will be some situations where it's morally acceptable and maybe even obligatory for you to kill another person. Imagine that you had an entire family and there's a dangerous criminal killer in your house. Maybe you're morally obligated to kill that person in order to protect your family. So there are all kinds of situations like this that will make us question these rules. Right? Now, you might think, and maybe some of you out there, some of you clever folks out there are thinking like, well, We just need to make the rules more complicated, right? So the rule really isn't don't kill. It's something like don't kill unless you're being attacked, or you're in a war, or such and such. And and if we spell out the rule, it will be this sort of long, complicated thing with all these qualifications about when to kill, when you can't kill, and things like that. So you might think that actually the list idea is fine. It's just that our rules are way too simple. At least the rules on my little example list are way too simple. And what we really need to do is just codify the actual moral rules, which are very, very complicated, right? So let's imagine we could do that. Let's just say, okay, fine. Imagine that we could. Imagine that we could specify, when exactly you should kill, when exactly it's okay to steal, when it's not. We could do that for all the various, actions that we could take, and we get this very complicated set of rules. I mean, imagine that it's 2,000 pages long, right? With all the, describing every scenario and how you can act in it. Would we then have a good moral theory? Well, a lot of philosophers and people who think about this would be very dissatisfied with this. They would say, well, no, not really. And the problem that would arise for this kind of complicated set of rules, well, there'll be a couple problems. But the one that I want to talk about is theoretically it would be very unsatisfying, and that it wouldn't really, we might think that it's not really telling us ultimately what it is to do the right thing, right? We'd have all these rules, and let's just take the action, say the rules that tell us what we can't do. I'd have all these things about what we can't do in various situations, but we might want to know, well, why? Why is it that we can't do this? If we can't steal in all these varying situations, and we can't kill, and we can't lie in these situations, why is that? Is it just some brute fact with no further explanation, or is there something that makes all these various kind of actions all what we call morally wrong, right? I mean, just the fact that we call them all immoral suggests that there's some kind of uniting factor, some kind of essential feature of them that makes them all wrong. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say I wanted to know what color is a good one. Let's say I wanted to know what it was to be red, what it was to be the color red. And, as a theory, let's say I asked that question, and I said, well, okay, let me try to answer that question. And my answer was to say, well, a stop sign is red, and a fire truck is red, and, the shirt that my friend Jones over there is wearing, that's red. And I went on and just sort of named a bunch of things that were red, and I came up with this list of red things. I said that's what it is to be red. Would that be a theoretically satisfying theory of what it is to be red? No, it would suffer from the same problem. We might say, okay, well, the fire truck is red, and the stop sign is red, and the sweatshirt over there is red, but why is it that they are all the red things? What about them makes them red? We haven't really come up with the essence of red, the feature that unites them all. And that's what we're looking for when we want a theory of redness. So suppose then that I came along and said, okay, well, I'll tell you what makes them all red. The surface of all those objects is such that it reflects electromagnetic radiation in a very certain range, a certain wavelength, right? And that wavelength interacts with through our eyes into our rods and cones and produces this sensation to us that appears a very distinct way. That's what all those things have in common. They all reflect just that wavelength of light, and that's why that's what makes them red. Now, that's a better theory, right? That would tie together, that would give a unifying theory. It would describe what all the red things have in common. They all have this feature of reflecting this very specific wavelength of electromagnetic radiation. So that's theoretically a lot more satisfying. And that's the kind of thing we want with our theory of right action. We don't just want a laundry list of things that are right or wrong, and we just name them that way. We want to say, well, what makes all the right things right? What makes all the wrong things wrong? What is the unifying feature? And okay, so I think that's a good analogy to show you the kind of thing that we're looking for theoretically, and also gives you an example of the kind of thing that we could find. Now, actually, just so you know, that turns out not to be the best theory of why red things are red. It's a lot more complicated. It would be nice if it was that simple, but it turns out to be surprisingly a lot more complicated about why the red things are red. So the physics and the philosophy of color are a very fascinating topic, but we're not going to talk about that now. Okay, so I'm just trying to give you a little setup, a little background about what the kind of theory we're after when we're looking for a theory of right action, and the stuff that I'm telling you now about it being theoretically satisfying. It's a general point in philosophy about the kind of thing we're trying to do, and really in any academic discipline, we want to reduce things to the most basic. We want to reduce our theories of things to the most basic fundamental level, where we're really telling you what at the base something is. And that's what we're trying to do for our theory of right action too. So the list is not, just coming up with a list is not going to be ultimately satisfying, and we hope at least to do better than that. Whether we can actually do better than that or not is a good question. And ultimately, well, if you're pessimistic, you might think that we're not going to be able to do better than come up with just a list. But we're going to consider at least one theory that tries to do something better than a list.